Hello and welcome to Tech Raven. I'm Nigel Cooper, and today I'm going to be showing you how to mic up an acoustic drum kit in a way that will get you really good quality studio production sounding results with just 4 microphones on a budget as well, because these 4 microphones don't exactly cost the earth. So I'm going to be discussing the microphones, what makes and model they are. I'll also be giving you some handy hints and tips on how to set it up to get the sound that I get here. And then I'll be doing a recording and I'll be showing you just briefly a few things that I do in post-production. I'm going to be using Logic, but whether you use Pro Tools, Ableton, whatever, your DAW will have the same plugins that I'm using, I'm sure. What I'm doing in post is fairly simple, but very, very effective. Now, the reason I've gone for 4 microphones here is I don't like to overcomplicate setting up drum kits. Admittedly, in a lot of studios, they'll have 2 microphones on the snare. They'll have one for the top head and another one, you know, to get these snares on the bottom. You can run into phase issues with that. You've got to remember that the bottom microphone has got to have the phase reversed. But again, you don't have to worry about that here because I'm only using the 1 microphone. And again, in the studio, they might have 2 mics on the kick drum. They might have one buried deep inside the head, close to the batter head, and another one on the outside near the resonant head. I've only got 1, so we haven't got that to worry about, and only 2 overheads. But the results I'm going to get here are going to be really good, and you'll hear that shortly. So the kit I'm using is a standard Yamaha Stage Custom with a snare, 10, 12, 14-inch toms, a couple of crashes, a ride and hi-hats, and a double kick pedal. It's the 20-inch kick drum rather than 22. It just sounds a bit, well, punchy for me. I sort of prefer that. So it's no big deal with the kit. They're only about £700 new. These, you'll probably know about it. It's a very famous kit. Lots of students use them. The microphones I'm using are made by a company called Lewitt, which is spelled L-E-W-I-T-T. And no, there's no affiliation here. I just love these microphones, so I figured that I would share them with you and tell you about the makes and models and how much they cost. Now, Lewitt, the Austrian company, make a microphone kit called a beat kit, which consists of the kick mic, the snare mic, and 2 overhead mics. And in the UK, it comes in at about £429. So the kick microphone is called a DTP 340REX. The snare microphone that I've got here is called an MTP 440DM, and the 2 overheads are called the LCT 040. Now, I'm actually not using the LCT 040 overheads in this instance. I'm actually using the Lewitt LCT 140 Air microphones. They're basically the same thing, apart from the fact that they got a sound switch and filter and pad switches, but apart from that, they're pretty much identical. So what I'm going to basically just cover now is a lot of people would use like a small mixer and have all the microphones going into that and then have that going into a laptop. Now, I don't really like doing that because if you do, you've got to get the levels and the sliders all perfect on the mixer, because on your laptop, all you're going to have is basically a stereo signal going in. So if something's too loud on the snare or the kick, you're not going to be able to adjust it later. So instead of doing that, I don't know if you can see it just on the floor here, that I've actually got a Focusrite audio interface, which is a Scarlett 18i8, which has got 4 XLR inputs. The audio interface make and model doesn't matter as long as it's got 4 inputs for 4 microphones. The only other thing it will need to have, and that's one reason I like this Focusrite, is because for inputs 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, you can turn off phantom power or turn on phantom power for those 4 inputs, either for the first 2 or the second 2. Now, given that the snare microphone and the kick microphone are both dynamic microphones, I've got those going into inputs 1 and 2, and there's no phantom power because they don't require it. Whereas the 2 overheads are condenser microphones, so I've got those going into input 3 and 4 with the phantom power active because they're going to require that. And then in Logic, I just set up 4 individual tracks, 1 for the snare, 1 for the kick, and 1 for the overhead left and 1 for the overhead right. So I've got 4 individual tracks. And then basically what I do is, with my closed-back headphones on, I just give the drums a hit and check the levels to make sure the levels are going through perfectly okay. Now, with regard to a few tips, the snare drum microphone is probably, in my opinion, the most tricky to get right. Now here, I've actually got the microphone set about 1 centimetre away from the edge of the rim, so it's kind of pointing towards the rim a little bit. Now I find by doing this, you get a nice crack because there's only 1 microphone, so there's nothing on the bottom to pick up these snares. So if you angle the mic in and you've got it about an inch over the rim pointing towards the center, you'll get a fuller, more round sound, but there won't be as much as a crack there. It'll be just a full kind of snare sound without too much of the actual snare wires cracking in the background. So I find by having it about a centimetre away from the edge of the rim, pointing kind of towards the rim and the head at the same time, gives you a bit of a crack while maintaining some of the body. So what I'd recommend experimenting with when it comes to the snare drum microphone is to not have it more than 2 inches away from the outside of the rim, and don't come in more than about 1.5 inches either, and just sort of move it back and forth between those 2 points. And with your closed back headphones on, you can take your stick and you can be giving it a hit. And don't forget to throw the snares off in case you're doing a recording that doesn't have snares, to see how that sounds too. And then once you've got the angle, again, you can sort of experiment with angling the mic down a little bit like that, more into the rim to get more of a crack. Whereas if you have it a bit lower, just above the rim pointing into the center, there's going to be less crack and a more whole kind of sound. So that's what I'd do there, just sort of experiment, moving it back and forth a little bit, about 1 inch outside and 1 inch inside the rim and everywhere in between, and angle it up and down a little bit as well, and just listen through closed back headphones while hitting it to see what sounds good. Now you're going to have to turn the volume up quite loud in your headphones because you're going to get a lot of bleed coming off the kit, so you might not be able to hear what you're getting through the microphone. Now in an ideal world, some in-ear monitors would be ideal because you can put those in your ears, and then on top of that you can buy some of those like 3M ear defenders which reduce the outside noise by about 35 dB, and you can put those on over the top of your in-ear monitors. That way you've got the in-ear monitors in your ears with ear defenders over the top. That way when you're hitting the drums, you're only going to hear the microphone and you're not going to get any drum sound bleeding in that's going to basically influence how you think the microphone is sounding. So that's just a tip there to get that right. Okay, moving on to the kick drum microphone. Again, most studios would have two. They'd have one buried deep inside the kick drum, maybe just a few inches away from the batter head, so that when it actually gets, the beater hits it, it's going to pick up that instant kind of attack, and you're going to get that sort of batter head sound. And then they'll have another microphone on the outside, just outside the hole at the other side, to pick up the resonant head. I've only got one microphone here for simplicity purposes. I found with this particular microphone, having it so that the mesh on the microphone is half inside the hole and half outside the hole, I found that to be about the sweet spot. I've tried pushing it in up to about 7-8 inches and moving it out. If you got it in too far, you'll get a lot of attack off the batter head, but you're not going to get much resonance and much body. Whereas if you got it a couple of inches too far outside the hole, you're just going to be kind of getting a woolly body sound with no attack. So I found having, like I said, the mesh grill of the microphone half in and half outside the hole, but angled and pointing in directly towards where the beater is actually hitting the head. So it's actually going to be picking that up with resonant sound off the front resonant head as well on the other side. So that is the kick drum microphone taken care of. Now with regard to the two overheads, I don't like to have them too far apart. The further apart you have them, the more spread you're going to get in a stereo field. But if you're a drummer, when you're sitting there playing, the stereo field isn't that wide. I mean, you know, there's only that much distance between the two crashes and the hi-hat and the ride. You know, it doesn't spread out that wide. So I don't like to spread the microphones out too wide to try and make that sound extra fake. And from the audience point of view, it's even narrower, because if you're in the audience listening to a drum, it's just all coming from one focused spot. So whether you're panning you know, right, left, or left, right from the drummer's perspective or from the audience perspective, I don't like to spread that out too wide. So with my overheads, I've got the left one approximately above the left-hand crash, but pointing down and angled sort of towards this tom. And for the right-hand one, again, it's kind of angled down, coming down towards his tom. A lot of people will point them both towards his snare. But at the end of the day, they're so high up, by the time it spreads out, it's going to be picking up all of this anyway. It's not a very kind of focused zone that these mics have. It's going to be sort of spreading out and picking up everything. So that left mic, yes, it will pick up this crash more than this mic will pick up this one. But by the time you get down to the toms here, these two toms are going to be picked up fairly evenly between the left and the right overheads, because I've actually got them positioned about 1 meter higher than these two cymbals just out of shot. If I stand up here, I'm actually touching the tip of one there, so it's nearly 1 meter away from those two cymbals. Now, another tip here with regard to the two overheads, if you bring them down and you've got them literally just about a foot above the two crashes, you're going to get a lot more crashing, very loud crash cymbals, and the toms will be quieter, because when you basically do test recordings and hit these cymbals, by the time you bring that level down, the fall off by the time it reaches the toms, they're going to be very quiet. So if you want a more even sound between the toms and the crashes, move them higher, because if you take them further away, the time it's going to take this and the tom to reach the microphone isn't going to be too far apart, so they're going to be more level and nicer to listen to in the final recording. The only other thing to remember with your two overheads is to get the equidistance between the snare drum the same. Now, a lot of people overthink this. They start getting tape measures out and cables, and they'll stand there with a cable held at the center of the drum, and they'll basically stick it up to that mic and move over to make sure the distance is exactly the same. It doesn't matter if you're a few inches out. You don't have to be that accurate with it. We're only talking milliseconds here. Admittedly, if I had that overhead halfway down about here, then the snare sound is going to reach it twice as quick as that one. But we're talking milliseconds here. Don't overthink it. As long as they're approximately the same distance each away from the center of the snare, you're not going to get any phase issues. If you're a couple of inches out, it's not going to matter. Now, I'm not using the Glyn Johns technique here. The Glyn Johns technique that I used on the first couple of Led Zeppelin albums is exactly what I've got here. The only difference is that right hand overhead is brought right down, and it's basically put about here, really low, coming in, pointing towards the snare drum again, depending on where this cymbal is going to be located, of course, because one thing you don't want to do with microphones is have one here. I mean, if this was a microphone, for argument's sake, and I had it here, and you hit this cymbal, as the cymbal moves up and down, it's moving up and down across the microphone, so you get this horrible kind of sound, which sounds horrible. So if you've got a microphone down here, you just make sure that it's not going to be on the plane of the cymbal where it's going to be moving, the cymbal's going to be moving across the microphone. So you'd probably have it about here or something like that, coming down towards the snare, and that would be the Glyn Johns technique. Again, I'm not using that. I've got them both spaced equally up in the air, coming down towards this tom and that tom, but similar distance from the snare drum. So yeah, I think that's about it covered there. Also, with regard to panning in post, I mean, I'll cover this in post-production a little bit, but a lot of drummers and home recording guys, they like to pan hard left and hard right for the two overhead microphones. I don't do that because I think it just sounds a little bit unnatural. Again, as a drummer, when you're sitting here, it's not actually spread out that wide. The drums don't have this big wide stereo field, and for the audience members, it's the same. There's no big wide stereo field. So I like to do what Glyn Johns does here, and basically just have about halfway to the right and halfway to the left. Now in Logic, that's going to be plus 32 and minus 32 on the pan dials. So it spreads it out a little bit, but not, you know, 100% hard left and hard right. I just find by doing it about halfway, again in Logic, plus 32 and minus 32, it's just more natural. It's just a more pleasing sound. So, okay, let me get Logic set up, and I'll put a backing track on, put my headphones on, I'll make a recording, and then I'll jump into Logic, show you the basic things that I do in there in post-production, and then I'll let you hear and see the final performance. Okay, so what I'm going to do here, I'm just going to quickly show you what I did in Logic, but I'm not going to delve into each and every plugin and all the settings because it's irrelevant. But here on the overhead right, I just had a little bit of EQ and tape saturation and compression over the top. Again, the individual settings for what I've got here are going to be totally different to what you're going to have with your recording. So again, it's pointless me going into any great details. On the overhead left here, I just had again a little bit of EQ, tape saturation and compression, exactly the same ones for both overheads. And then on the, where are we, the snare drum, something a little bit different here. Again, I adjusted the EQ slightly differently, and a bit of tape saturation again there, just to give the snare drum a bit more crack. And then for the kick drum, I went for an emphasis of bass here, so I've basically used a few bass plugins, this Maserati and the R-Bass, as well as adjusting the EQ a lot different to the previous ones, and the usual compression for that as well. Again, you're going to have to sort of tailor this to how your recording comes out on your acoustic kits. I did actually make a few little adjustments for the backing track as well, because it's quite a weedy sounding backing track, so I just tried to give it a little bit more bottom end with a few plugins here. So that's pretty much all I did. Again, your settings for your drum kit are going to be totally different to mine, because you're going to be using a different drum kit, different heads, a different room. So again, it's going to be pointless me going into my settings, because they just won't work for whatever drum kit or recording environment you had yourself. Okay, so after everything that I'd done, I wasn't thrilled with the results that I was getting, because mixing and mastering drums is not exactly my forte. I find it to be something of an art form. So I gave it to somebody else that I know to see if they could improve on what I've done, and they did by quite a long way. This is basically what they did, quite a lot of plugins here, and there was one outboard piece of hardware for saturation. Again, pointless me going into any of these plugins or settings, because depending on your drum kit, the heads, the way you play, your recording environment, the mic positions, all that is going to be totally different anyway, and you're going to be doing completely different things in whatever DAW you use. Okay, I would just quickly like to point out, before giving you a couple of examples, that what I'm trying to create here is a realistic recording environment, which most of us will be doing. So at the end of the day, the kit I was using, a Yamaha Stage Custom, it's a fairly student kit. It's not exactly a German-Made Sonor kit, and the heads that were on this kit were not ideal, and they weren't the best heads in the world either. And it wasn't exactly tuned by Dave Weckl. And to add insult to injury, it was recorded in a standard living room rather than a nice large drum studio with proper acoustic treatment. So at the end of the day, it's like the old saying, garbage in equals garbage out. Now, the original stems of this recording, they weren't fantastic. They were pretty good, but they were hardly ideal because of the aforementioned reasons. But at the end of the day, what it's about when it comes to acoustic drum recordings, it's about what you do with it afterwards in post-production. So everybody is going to have to do quite a lot of post-work on their drum recordings to get a good sound. Okay, so with that in mind, let me give you a couple of examples.
Gather in their masses, just like witches at black masses. Death and hatred to mankind, poisoning their brainwashed mind.